The flashing neon sign of the Silver Spoon Diner buzzed like an angry hornet against the relentless Oregon rain. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and fried onions. To most, it was just a cheap late-night sanctuary. But for the two arrogant patrolmen stepping through the glass doors, it was a stage for their petty tyranny. They saw a quiet, weather-beaten man in a tattered army jacket sitting in the corner booth and decided he was a stain on their evening. They thought they were picking on a helpless drifter. They had no idea that the quiet man nursing a cup of black coffee had walked through the fires of hell, or that the single phone call he was about to make would completely obliterate their lives, their badges, and their freedom by sunrise. The rain in Oak Haven did not just fall, it assaulted the pavement. It was a freezing Tuesday night in mid-November, the kind of night that drove the stray dogs into the storm drains and forced the city's forgotten souls to seek whatever meager warmth they could find. Samuel T. Washington was one of those souls. At 52 years old, Samuel carried the weight of a lifetime that most men could barely endure in nightmares. He moved with a pronounced, rhythmic limp, a permanent souvenir from a piece of jagged shrapnel he had taken during an ambush in the Arghandab River Valley. He had served 20 years in the United States Army, the bulk of it as a squad leader in the 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. Samuel pulled the collar of his faded olive-drab field jacket tighter around his neck as he approached the glowing windows of the Silver Spoon Diner. His boots were soaked through, and his fingers were numb, stiff with the cold and the creeping arthritis that accompanied his old injuries. He paused at the door, catching his reflection in the wet glass. He looked rough. His dark skin was ashen from the cold. His graying beard was wild, and his clothes were the uniform of the streets. But beneath the worn exterior, his posture remained rigidly straight. The discipline forged at Fort Benning never truly washed away, no matter how hard life rained on him. Pushing the heavy glass door open, the bell above chimed a cheerful, high-pitched note that felt entirely out of place against the dreary night. The diner was nearly empty. A long-haul trucker named Pete was hunched over a plate of meatloaf at the counter, and a young couple sat whispering in a far booth. The heat hit Samuel like a physical wave, causing him to suppress a shiver. He walked slowly toward the back corner booth, taking care not to track too much mud onto the checkered linoleum floor. Jessica Miller, a waitress working the graveyard shift to pay her way through community college, looked up from wiping down the espresso machine. She had seen plenty of drifters come and go, but there was something remarkably calm about this man. He didn't dart his eyes around nervously or immediately head for the restrooms to wash up. He just sat down, placed a worn canvas duffel bag gently on the seat beside him, and folded his large, calloused hands on the Formica table. Jessica grabbed a menu and a steaming pot of coffee, walking over to his booth. "Evening, sir." "Awful night to be out in it," she said, her voice carrying a genuine warmth. Samuel looked up, his dark eyes reflecting a profound, quiet gratitude. "It certainly is, miss. The rain hasn't stopped since Tuesday." His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, smooth and polite. "Can I start you off with a cup of coffee?" Jessica asked, already turning over the thick ceramic mug on his table. "Please, just black is fine." "And?" Samuel reached into his damp jacket pocket, pulling out a small, carefully folded wad of single-dollar bills and a few quarters. He placed them on the table, counting them with deliberate slowness. $4.75. Could I get a slice of the cherry pie, if that covers it?" "It covers it with tax," Jessica smiled softly, pouring the dark liquid. "I'll bring that right out to you." "Take your time. Warm up." Samuel nodded. "Thank you." "You are very kind." For 10 minutes, Samuel sat in absolute peace. He wrapped his frozen hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into his aching joints. The coffee was bitter and burned on the way down, but it was the best thing he had tasted in weeks. He closed his eyes, briefly transported away from the cold streets of Oak Haven, Oregon, back to the chaotic but structured brotherhood of his past. The bell above the diner door chimed again, violently this time. The door was shoved open with unnecessary force, crashing against the rubber doorstop. Officers Bradley Mitchell and Kevin Rostover swaggered into the diner. They were the Oak Haven Police Department's most notorious bullies, two men who hid their deep-seated insecurities behind brass badges and department-issued firearms. Mitchell, the senior of the two, was a thick-necked man with a permanent scowl and a reputation for using excessive force on suspects who couldn't afford lawyers. Rostover was younger, eager to please, and possessed a cruel, snickering laugh that followed his partner's worst remarks. The atmosphere in the diner immediately shifted. The young couple lowered their voices to a terrified hush. Pete the trucker kept his eyes glued to his meatloaf. Even Jessica stiffened behind the counter. Mitchell and Rostover had a habit of eating for free, leaving a mess and making the staff deeply uncomfortable. "Smells like wet dog in here tonight, Kev," Mitchell announced loudly, unhooking his heavy utility belt and letting it rest lower on his hips. He wiped the rain from his buzzed haircut, scanning the room with predatory eyes. His gaze swept past the empty booths, past the trucker, and locked dead onto the back corner. He saw the worn olive jacket. He saw the worn duffel bag. He saw Samuel. Mitchell's lip curled into a sneer. He nudged Rostover, pointing a thick finger toward the back. "Looks like Betty Lou is running a homeless shelter now. Check out the garbage taking up our usual booth." "Disgusting," Rostover chuckled, shaking his head. "You want me to take out the trash, Brad?" "No." Mitchell grinned, adjusting his collar. "Let's both go have a little chat with the local wildlife." Samuel took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He had heard their heavy boots hit the linoleum. He had heard the comment. He recognized the tone perfectly. It was the tone of men who had been given a tiny fraction of power and had let it completely rot their souls. Samuel didn't move. He kept his eyes on his coffee mug, preparing himself for the storm that was about to break inside the warm diner. The heavy, rhythmic thud of police boots approached Samuel's booth, stopping just inches from the edge of his table. The smell of cheap cologne and wet wool uniforms masked the scent of the cherry pie Jessica had just placed in front of him. "Hey, you!" Mitchell barked, his voice loud enough to echo off the diner's tin ceiling. Samuel finished his bite of pie, swallowed slowly, and looked up. He didn't flinch. He didn't cower. He met Mitchell's aggressive stare with the stoic, unwavering gaze of a man who had stared down heavily armed insurgents in the mountains of the Middle East. "Can I help you, officers?" Samuel asked, his tone level, devoid of any insolence, but entirely lacking the fear Mitchell was accustomed to receiving. Mitchell placed his hands on his utility belt, leaning his considerable bulk over the table. "Yeah, you can help us. You can pack up your garbage and get the hell out of here. You're stinking up the place, and you're sitting in our booth." Jessica, who was wiping down the counter nearby, took a hesitant step forward. "Officer Mitchell, he's a paying customer. He just ordered—" "Shut it, Miller," Rostover snapped, turning to glare at the waitress. "Nobody asked you. Go pour some coffee before we decide to cite this dump for health code violations." Jessica backed away, her hands trembling, but she reached for her apron pocket, clutching her cell phone out of sight. Samuel slowly set his fork down on the napkin. "I paid for my meal, officer. The receipt is right there." He pointed to the small white slip of paper next to his mug. "It is pouring rain outside. I intend to finish my pie and my coffee, and then I will leave." Mitchell's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He wasn't used to being told no, especially not by someone he viewed as society's refuse. "Listen to me, you vagrant," Mitchell hissed, his spit flying onto the table. "I don't care if you bought the whole damn pie. The management reserves the right to refuse service to anyone. And as an agent of the city, I'm telling you that you are loitering. Now get up." Loitering is defined as remaining in a public place with no apparent purpose, Samuel recited calmly, a faint edge of authority creeping into his voice. "My purpose is consuming the meal I legally purchased. I am not breaking any laws." Rostova let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, we got a street corner lawyer here, Brad. A regular legal scholar in a dumpster dive jacket." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. He noticed the faded, frayed patch on the shoulder of Samuel's jacket, the faint outline of the Ranger scroll. He reached out and aggressively jabbed a finger into Samuel's shoulder, right on the old shrapnel wound. Samuel gritted his teeth, a flash of pure agony shooting down his arm, but he didn't cry out. "What's this?" Mitchell sneered. "Stolen valor too? You buy this at a surplus store so people will throw loose change in your cup? Makes you feel like a tough guy?" "Do not touch me," Samuel said. His voice dropped an octave. It wasn't a shout, it was a command, laced with a dangerous, quiet intensity that made the trucker at the counter suddenly stop chewing. "Or what?" Mitchell challenged, his ego completely overriding his common sense. "You gonna assault a police officer? Give me a reason, old man. Please, give me one reason to lay you out right here." To provoke Samuel further, Mitchell casually swept his arm across the table. His thick forearm caught the ceramic coffee mug. It shattered against the edge of the table, sending scalding black coffee splashing all over Samuel's lap and the canvas duffel bag on the seat beside him. "Oops," Mitchell smirked. "Looks like you made a mess. Now you really have to leave." The diner fell dead silent. The only sound was the coffee dripping off the edge of the table onto the linoleum. Samuel looked down at his soaked trousers, feeling the burning heat against his skin. He took a deep, stabilizing breath. He had survived IEDs, starvation, and the loss of his brothers. He would not let a small-town tyrant break his discipline. Samuel slowly stood up. Because of his bad knee, the movement was rigid and awkward. To Mitchell, it looked like a threat. "He's resisting," Rostova yelled, instantly unsnapping the retention strap on his holster. Before Samuel could fully stand, Mitchell lunged forward. He grabbed the lapels of Samuel's wet jacket and violently yanked the older man out of the booth. The sudden force pulled Samuel off balance. His bad leg gave out entirely, and he crashed hard to the diner floor, his shoulder slamming into the metal base of a stool. A sharp gasp echoed from the young woman in the corner booth. Jessica cried out, "Stop it! He wasn't doing anything!" "Stay back," Rostova barked, placing his hand on his taser, sweeping his gaze across the terrified patrons. "Police business." Samuel lay on the cold, wet floor, staring up at the harsh fluorescent lights. A blinding pain radiated from his spine. His canvas duffel bag had tumbled down with him. The zipper, already compromised from years of wear, burst open under the impact. The meager contents of Samuel T. Washington's life spilled out across the dirty linoleum. A spare pair of wool socks, a worn toothbrush, a Bible with a cracked leather spine, and a small, heavy, felt-lined wooden box that popped open as it hit the ground. Out of the box tumbled a piece of metal attached to a red, white, and blue ribbon. It skidded across the floor, stopping right at the tip of Officer Mitchell's polished black boot. Beside it lay a folded, heavily laminated piece of paper, a military citation. Mitchell looked down, his brow furrowing, as he nudged the metal star with his toe. "What's this junk?" he muttered. He leaned down and picked up the laminated paper, squinting at the fine print. He read aloud in a mocking, exaggerated voice. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy. Sergeant First Class Samuel T. Washington. Mitchell paused, letting out a loud, braying laugh. He looked down at Samuel, who was struggling to push himself up on his good arm. "Wow, you really went all out on the fake backstory, didn't you, Sammy?" Mitchell sneered, tossing the citation back onto the floor like a piece of garbage. "A silver star. You expect me to believe a pathetic, smelly bum like you is a war hero? You're a fraud. And now you're under arrest for trespassing, resisting an officer, and assaulting an officer." "I didn't touch you," Samuel rasped, his breath coming in shallow waves due to the pain in his back. "My shirt is wrinkled. That's assault where I come from," Mitchell laughed, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Roll over on your stomach and put your hands behind your back. Now!" Samuel did not roll over. He pulled his legs in, sitting up slowly on the floor amidst the scattered ruins of his belongings. He meticulously reached out, picking up his silver star, wiping a drop of spilled coffee from the ribbon with his thumb, and placed it back into the wooden box. He did the same with the citation. His movements were terrifyingly deliberate. "I said on your stomach, dirtbag!" Mitchell roared, pulling his baton from his belt and slapping it against his open palm. "Officer," Samuel said, looking directly into Mitchell's eyes. The stoicism was gone. In its place was a cold, calculating look that made Rostova take a half step backward. "You have assaulted me, destroyed my property, and falsely accused me of a crime. I know the law, and I know my rights." "You don't have rights in my town, bum," Mitchell spat. "Before you put those cuffs on me," Samuel continued, ignoring the threat, his voice echoing cleanly through the silent diner, "I am entitled to a phone call. I want it now." Rostova laughed nervously. "He thinks he's at the precinct already. Tell him to shut up, Brad." But Mitchell paused. His ego was so bloated, so entirely unchecked by years of facing no consequences, that he saw this as a golden opportunity for further humiliation. He wanted this man utterly broken before he dragged him out into the freezing rain in handcuffs. "You want a phone call?" Mitchell said, a cruel, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Sure, hero. Let's see who you're going to call. You're going to call the president, or maybe your mummy to come pick you up. Go ahead. Make the call. Let's see who cares about a homeless piece of trash." Samuel reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket. Mitchell instantly tightened his grip on his baton, but Samuel slowly produced a battered, archaic flip phone. It was an old military-grade model, encased in thick rubber. He flipped it open. The screen glowed with a faint green light. He dialed an area code, followed by 7 digits. He didn't have to look at a contact list. He had memorized this number 15 years ago, in a hospital ward in Landstuhl, Germany. It was a private, direct line. Very few people in the world had it. The phone rang twice. On the third ring, a voice answered. It wasn't a secretary. It wasn't an answering machine. It was a sharp, awake, authoritative voice, despite the fact that it was past midnight. "Callahan." Mayor Robert Bobb. Callahan of Oak Haven was not just the mayor. Before he entered politics and took absolute control of the city's administration and its notoriously corrupt police department, he was a colonel in the United States Army. And before he was a colonel, his only son, First Lieutenant David Callahan, had served in the 75th Ranger Regiment. David Callahan had come home in a flag-draped casket, but he had come home whole, his body recovered under heavy enemy fire by his squad leader, Sergeant First Class Samuel T. Washington. "Bob," Samuel spoke into the receiver. His voice was calm, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. "It's Samuel Washington." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. The rustling of bedsheets stopped instantly. "Samuel, good God, man. It's been a long time. Where are you? Are you all right?" The mayor's voice shifted from bureaucratic sharpness to profound, emotional urgency. "I am currently on the floor of the Silver Spoon Diner on 4th and Elm," Samuel stated, his eyes locked on Officer Mitchell, who was leaning against the counter, mockingly pretending to check his watch. "I was attempting to eat a slice of pie. 2 of your city's police officers are currently standing over me. One of them just threw me to the ground, destroyed my personal property, and stepped on the silver star your son put in for me. They are preparing to arrest me for, as they put it, being a vagrant." The silence that radiated from the tiny speaker of the flip phone was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a catastrophic explosion. Mitchell let out a loud guffaw. "Oh, this is rich. Who are you talking to, your imaginary friend? Wrap it up, Spielberg. Time to go to jail." Over the phone, a low, dangerous voice crackled. It sounded like a coiled rattlesnake. "Samuel, put the phone on speaker. Now." Samuel pulled the phone away from his ear and pressed the speaker button. He held it out in his palm. "You're on speaker, Bob," Samuel said. Mitchell chuckled, leaning down toward the phone. "Listen here, whoever this is. This man is under arrest. If you're his social worker, you can come bail him out at the precinct tomorrow morning, assuming we process him by then." The voice that boomed out of the tiny phone speaker was deafening in the quiet diner. "Officer, this is Mayor Robert Callahan, and you have exactly 10 seconds to tell me your badge number before I personally come down there and rip it off your chest." The color drained from Officer Mitchell's face so fast it looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew that voice. Every cop in the city knew that voice. The mayor was a hard-liner, a man who ran the police department with an iron fist. Rostover physically stumbled backward, knocking over a chair with a loud clatter. Mayor Callahan," he stammered, his voice cracking like a terrified teenager's. "I'm waiting for the badge number." The mayor roared through the speaker, the sound vibrating across the diner tables. "Who am I speaking to?" Mitchell's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. The baton slipped from his grip and clattered onto the linoleum. Sir, Mayor, sir. This is Officer Bradley Mitchell, badge number 4092. Sir, there's been a massive misunderstanding." "Mitchell," the mayor's voice dropped to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "I know exactly who you are. I've seen the excessive force complaints. I've let the commissioner handle them. But this? The man you just threw to the floor is an American hero who dragged my dead son out of a burning valley while taking enemy fire. He is a brother to my family." Mitchell swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He looked at Samuel, truly looking at him for the first time, and realized he hadn't just stepped on a landmine. He had thrown himself onto a live grenade. "You will not speak," Mayor Callahan continued, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "You will not move. You will not breathe in that man's direction. You are to stand at attention. The chief of police and I are en route. We will be there in 5 minutes. If either of you so much as twitches before I arrive, I will ensure you spend the rest of your miserable lives in a federal penitentiary. Do you understand me?" "Oh, yes, sir," Mitchell squeaked out, his knees physically trembling. "Yes, Mr. Mayor," Rostover cried, his hands instantly shooting up into the air in a gesture of surrender, terrified of making a sudden movement. Samuel calmly reached out and pressed the end call button. The diner returned to an eerie, suffocating silence. He slowly pushed himself off the floor, his face wincing slightly in pain. He didn't look at the officers. He didn't gloat. He simply walked back to his booth, sat down on the dry side of the seat, and looked at Jessica, the waitress, who was staring at him with wide, awe-struck eyes. "Miss," Samuel said politely, gesturing to the shattered ceramic on the floor. "I am terribly sorry about the mess. Could I trouble you for another cup of coffee? It seems it's going to be a long night." The 5 minutes that followed the termination of the phone call were an agonizing eternity for Officers Bradley Mitchell and Kevin Rostover. The Silver Spoon Diner, previously a casual late-night haunt, had transformed into a sterile, brightly lit purgatory. The rhythmic drumming of the Oregon rain against the large glass windows sounded like a ticking clock counting down to their inevitable doom. Samuel T. Washington sat perfectly still in his booth. Jessica Miller, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the carafe, had rushed over to pour him a fresh, steaming cup of black coffee. She quickly grabbed a stack of clean paper napkins, wordlessly offering them to Samuel to dab at the scalding stains on his worn trousers. Samuel offered her a gentle, reassuring nod. Mitchell remained exactly where he was, his polished boots rooted to the checkered linoleum. The heavy wooden baton he had so eagerly brandished lay abandoned near a discarded sugar packet. He looked at Rostover, whose face was the color of spoiled milk. Rostover's hands were still slightly raised, terrified that lowering them might be construed as an act of aggression by the phantom forces closing in on them. "Sir, Mr. Washington," Mitchell whispered, his voice entirely stripped of its former venom. It was a pathetic, reedy sound. "Listen, buddy, we got off on the wrong foot here. We've been working a double shift. Stress is high. Let's just call this water under the bridge, okay? You don't need to press this." Samuel did not look at him. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He kept his eyes focused on the rain streaking down the dark window pane. "I'll buy your meal," Mitchell pleaded, his desperation mounting as the seconds ticked by. "I'll give you whatever cash I have in my wallet right now, $200. Just tell the mayor it was a misunderstanding. A bad joke." Pete, the trucker sitting at the counter, finally spoke up, his voice dripping with disgust. "Shut your mouth, Badge. You made your bed. Now you're gonna lie in it." Before Mitchell could snap back, the diner's front window was suddenly bathed in a chaotic symphony of strobing red and blue lights. Not one, not two, but 4 black police SUVs tore into the wet parking lot, their tires screeching against the asphalt. The vehicles were not standard patrol cruisers. They were unmarked command vehicles. The diner doors violently flew open. The bell above chimed a frantic, terrified note before the door was practically ripped from its hinges. Mayor Robert "Bob" Callahan stormed into the diner. Even in his mid-60s, Callahan was a mountain of a man, carrying the unmistakable, ramrod-straight posture of a retired army colonel. He had thrown a heavy trench coat over his pajamas, his silver hair uncombed, but his eyes burned with a terrifying, absolute authority. Trailing immediately behind him was Thomas Harding, the Oak Haven chief of police, fully uniformed and looking exceptionally grim. Behind them, 4 heavily armed tactical officers secured the entrance. The atmosphere in the room plummeted to absolute zero. Mayor Callahan didn't look at the officers. His eyes scanned the diner until they landed on the back corner booth. He saw the spilled coffee, the shattered ceramic mug, the busted canvas duffel bag, and the wet-stained trousers of the man sitting calmly with his coffee. Callahan bypassed the terrified patrolman and walked directly to Samuel's booth. The mayor stopped, his broad shoulders heaving slightly as he took in the sight of the graying, weather-beaten veteran. For a moment, the hardened politician vanished, replaced by a grieving father who was staring at a living ghost. "Samuel," Callahan said, his voice thick with an emotion he fought fiercely to control. Samuel slowly stood up, ignoring the shooting pain in his back. He braced himself against the table, straightened his spine, and offered a crisp, flawless salute. "Evening, Colonel." Callahan didn't return the salute. Instead, he stepped forward, wrapped his large arms around Samuel, and pulled the filthy, rain-soaked homeless man into a deep, fierce embrace. "You stubborn son of a gun!" Callahan whispered fiercely into Samuel's shoulder. "Why didn't you tell me you were in Oregon? Why didn't you come to the house?" "I wasn't looking for a handout, Bob," Samuel replied softly, pulling back. "I was just passing through. I had something to deliver." Chief Harding stepped forward, his face a mask of professional fury. He looked at the floor, noting the broken box, the scattered military citation, and the silver star gleaming dully against the dirty tile. He then turned his gaze to Mitchell and Rostova, who were visibly trembling. "Mitchell! Rostova!" Chief Harding barked, the sound cracking like a whip. "Front and center! Now!" The two officers shuffled forward, their heads hung low, the swagger completely drained from their bodies. "Chief Harding, sir, we received a complaint about a vagrant harassing customers." Mitchell began to lie, his voice cracking. "We asked him to leave, and he became combative. He resisted." "Save it!" Harding cut him off abruptly. The chief turned to Jessica. "Miss, you work here. Did this man harass anyone?" Jessica stepped out from behind the counter, her fear replaced by righteous indignation. "No, sir. He was the most polite customer I've had all night. He paid for his meal in full. Those two officers walked in, called him garbage, knocked his hot coffee into his lap, and then Officer Mitchell dragged him out of the booth and threw him on the floor. He never raised his hand to them. Not once." "That's a lie!" Rostova shouted, panic overriding his sense of self-preservation. "She's lying to protect a bum." Pete the trucker spun his stool around. "She ain't lying, Chief. I saw the whole damn thing. That cop," Pete pointed a thick finger at Mitchell, "assaulted that man unprovoked, tossed his belongings on the ground and laughed about it." Chief Harding turned back to Mitchell. "Hand over your weapon and your badge, Mitchell. You too, Rostova." "Chief, please, you can't do this," Mitchell begged, his eyes darting frantically between Harding and the mayor. "I have 15 years on the force. You're going to take a waitress and a trucker's word over mine?" Mayor Callahan finally turned away from Samuel. He walked slowly toward Mitchell. The silence in the diner was so profound that the sound of Callahan's leather shoes squeaking on the wet linoleum was deafening. He stopped inches from Mitchell's face. "I don't need their word, Mitchell," Callahan said, his voice dangerously low, practically vibrating with rage. "Because I know the man you assaulted. 15 years ago, my son, First Lieutenant David Callahan, was pinned down in a burning valley in Afghanistan. He took a sniper round to the chest. The man you just called a bum ran through 80 yards of concentrated enemy machine gun fire to pull my boy behind cover. He took a piece of shrapnel to the spine doing it. He held my dying son in his arms and listened to his last words, so I wouldn't have to wonder what they were." Mitchell's breath hitched. He looked like he was about to be physically sick. "Strip your belts," Chief Harding ordered, his hand resting on his own sidearm. "Do it right now, or my tactical team will do it for you." With trembling, clumsy fingers, Mitchell and Rostova unbuckled their heavy utility belts. The leather hit the floor with a heavy, humiliating thud. They unpinned the silver shields from their chests and placed them on the nearest table. The power they had wielded like a blunt instrument just 20 minutes prior evaporated into the diner's stale air. "You are suspended without pay, effective immediately, pending a criminal investigation," Chief Harding announced, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "Officers Davis and Clark, step forward." Two of the tactical officers moved in, grabbing Mitchell and Rostova by their arms. "Wait!" Samuel's deep voice suddenly cut through the tension. He limped slowly out of the booth, walking toward the center of the diner. He knelt painfully on the wet floor, his bad knee popping loudly. He ignored the disgraced officers and reached for the broken wooden box. He gathered the splinters of the felt-lined wood. Then he picked up a small, folded piece of paper that had been tucked beneath the silver star, a paper that had been partially crushed under Mitchell's boot. It was a heavy, military-grade envelope, sealed with a wax stamp that had cracked. Samuel stood up and walked over to Mayor Callahan. He held out the envelope. It was stained with a single drop of spilled coffee, and a distinct muddy boot print marred the front. "I didn't just come to Oakhaven by accident, Bob," Samuel said softly, the harshness of the diner fading as he focused entirely on the grieving father before him. "David wrote this the night before the ambush. He made me promise that if anything happened, I would hand-deliver it to you. Not mail it, not hand it to a casualty officer. Give it directly to you." Callahan's hands shook as he took the envelope. He stared at his son's familiar handwriting, preserved for over a decade in the depths of Samuel's duffel bag. "I tried to come see you when I first got back," Samuel admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "But my mind wasn't right. The survivor's guilt. It was heavy, Bob. I spent years wandering, trying to figure out how to look you in the eye. I finally found the courage. I arrived in town tonight. I just wanted a cup of coffee to warm up before I walked up to your estate." Callahan looked from the envelope in his hand to the muddy boot print that defiled it. The realization of what had almost been lost, of what had been desecrated, slammed into the mayor with the force of a freight train. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes locking on to Bradley Mitchell. The look on the mayor's face was no longer just anger. It was the promise of utter, total destruction. "Chief Harding," Callahan said, his voice eerily calm, "I want their body cameras pulled. I want the dash cams from their cruiser pulled. I want a full audit of every single arrest they have made in the last 10 years. "Already in motion, Mr. Mayor," Harding replied sharply. "But we have a more immediate issue." Harding turned to Mitchell and Rostova. "You boys thought you were off the clock, didn't you? You forgot that the new department policy mandates body cameras remain in standby mode, actively buffering audio even when the visual recording is off." Rostova let out a pathetic whimper, his knees visibly buckling. "While we were en route," Harding continued, a predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth, "Dispatch accessed your live audio feed. We heard the whole thing. We heard the threat. We heard the assault. But more interestingly, we heard what you two were discussing in your cruiser right before you walked into this diner." Mitchell's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. Harding pulled a small digital tablet from his jacket, tapping the screen. The diner filled with the tinny, recorded voices of Mitchell and Rostova. "I'm telling you, Kev, we just popped the trunk on that Lincoln parked behind the dive bar. I've got 2 baggies of meth from the evidence locker in my jacket. We plant it, we bust the dealer, and we take whatever cash he's got in the glove box. It's a victimless crime. The guy's a scumbag anyway." The recording clicked off. The absolute silence that followed was suffocating. Conspiracy to commit evidence tampering, grand larceny, corruption under the color of law, and now the unprovoked assault of a decorated combat veteran and the destruction of personal property. Chief Harding listed the charges as if reading a menu. "You aren't just getting fired, boys. You're going to be the guests of honor at the federal penitentiary." "No, no, no," Mitchell babbled, tears finally spilling down his cheeks, mixing with the rain on his uniform. "Chief, please, it was just talk. We were just blowing off steam." "Turn them around," Harding ordered the tactical officers. "Right there, in the middle of the Silver Spoon diner, the two men who had terrorized Oak Haven's vulnerable populations were violently spun around. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoed loudly off the tin ceiling. It was the exact sound they had intended for Samuel just minutes before. "Read them their rights," Harding commanded, "and get this garbage out of my sight." As Mitchell and Rostova were dragged toward the diner doors, weeping and begging, Samuel watched them go. He felt no triumph, no joy in their downfall. He only felt a profound, exhausting sadness for the state of men who chose cruelty when they were entrusted with protection. Pete the trucker stood up from his stool, walked over, and spat a wad of chewing tobacco onto the floor right where Mitchell had been standing. "Good riddance," he muttered. Mayor Callahan clutched his son's letter to his chest. He looked at Samuel, the battered, brilliant soldier who had carried the heaviest burdens for so long. "You're not sleeping on the streets tonight, Samuel," Callahan said, his voice firm, brooking no argument. "You're coming home with me. My wife. She needs to see you. She needs to thank you." Samuel looked at his torn duffel bag, the scattered remnants of his transient life. Then he looked at the mayor, seeing the phantom of his lost lieutenant in the older man's eyes. Slowly, Samuel nodded. "I'd like that, Bob. I think I'm finally ready to come in from the cold." The morning after the incident at the Silver Spoon diner, the city of Oak Haven awoke to a seismic shift. The local news cycle, usually dominated by minor traffic accidents and city council zoning disputes, was entirely hijacked by leaked footage from the diner's security cameras. The video had no audio, but the visual of two heavily armed police officers physically assaulting a disabled, seated veteran was enough to ignite an absolute firestorm. By noon, national news networks had picked up the feed. Bradley Mitchell and Kevin Rostova were stripped of their badges, their department-issued firearms, and their dignity, traded instantly for standard-issue orange jumpsuits at the Oak Haven County Jail. They were placed in solitary confinement, not for their protection, but because Chief Thomas Harding refused to let them mingle with the general population they had spent years unjustly inflating. The hard karma they had invited did not just knock on their doors, it kicked them off the hinges. The audio recording of their cruiser conversation, detailing their premeditated plan to plant narcotics and steal cash, prompted a sweeping federal investigation. The FBI descended upon the Oak Haven Police Department, tearing through years of Mitchell and Rostova's arrest reports. What they found was a staggering, deeply entrenched pattern of extortion, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations. Faced with decades in a federal penitentiary, the fragile brotherhood between the two corrupt cops shattered instantly. In a desperate bid for self-preservation, Kevin Rostova turned state's evidence against his former mentor. Rostova signed a sworn affidavit detailing how Mitchell had orchestrated a systematic shakedown of local minority-owned businesses over a 5-year period. He provided federal prosecutors with dates, times, and the locations of Mitchell's hidden lockboxes containing stolen cash. When Mitchell learned of the betrayal from his heavily perspiring public defender, the older cop flew into a blind rage. He immediately countered, offering up a secret, encrypted hard drive he had kept as insurance. The drive contained dashcam footage Rostova had intentionally deleted, showing the younger officer severely beating a handcuffed suspect in an alleyway 2 years prior. They had metaphorically handed the prosecution the nails for each other's coffins. The trial took place 6 months later in the austere courtroom of federal judge William Peterson. It was a media circus, but inside the mahogany-paneled room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly serious. Mitchell and Rostova sat at separate defense tables, refusing to even look at one another. They were pale, gaunt, and completely stripped of the arrogant swagger that had once defined them. When Samuel T. Washington was called to the stand, a profound silence fell over the gallery. He wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit provided by Mayor Callahan, walking with the aid of a polished wooden cane. He took the oath with a steady hand and sat down, his posture just as rigid and disciplined as it had been in the diner booth. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp woman named Sarah Jenkins, guided him through the events of that freezing November night. Samuel recounted the harassment, the destruction of his property, and the physical assault with an icy, clinical precision. He did not embellish. He did not express anger. His absolute calmness was more devastating than any furious tirade could have been. "Mr. Washington," the defense attorney for Mitchell asked during cross-examination, desperately grasping at straws, "isn't it true you were wearing a tattered military jacket that night? And isn't it true you refused a direct order to vacate the premises?" Samuel looked directly at Mitchell, who immediately averted his eyes to the floor. "I was wearing the jacket I wore when I served my country," Samuel replied, his baritone voice echoing cleanly through the courtroom. "And I was sitting in a booth I had paid for, drinking a cup of coffee I had legally purchased. The only people breaking the law that night were the men sworn to uphold it." Judge Peterson's gavel came down with the finality of an executioner's axe. Due to the overwhelming mountain of evidence, much of it provided by the defendants against each other, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They were found guilty on all 27 counts, ranging from aggravated assault and battery to conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud and civil rights abuses under the color of law. At sentencing, Judge Peterson looked down at the two men with absolute disgust. "You were given a badge and a gun to protect the vulnerable. Instead, you preyed upon them to feed your own pathetic egos. You looked at a decorated American hero and saw only an opportunity for cruelty. You are a disgrace to the uniform, and you are a danger to society." Bradley Mitchell was sentenced to 22 years in a maximum security federal prison with no possibility of early parole. Kevin Rostova, despite his cooperation, was handed 15 years. As the bailiffs moved in to heavily shackle them, the final twist of the knife was delivered. They were assigned to different penitentiaries, stripping them of the only person left in the world who understood their spectacular fall from grace. They were to serve their time completely alone. While the walls of a federal prison closed in on his attackers, the world opened up for Samuel T. Washington. The night he stepped into the mayor's estate, he didn't just find a warm bed. He found the family he thought he had lost forever in the Arghandab River Valley. Martha Callahan, a remarkably strong woman whose grief had aged her prematurely, had wept openly when Samuel handed her the stained, crinkled envelope containing her son's final words. They sat by the fireplace late into the night, Samuel recounting stories of David's bravery, his terrible jokes, and the profound love the young lieutenant had for his parents. For the first time in 15 years, Samuel felt the crushing weight of his survivor's guilt begin to fracture and dissolve. Mayor Callahan proved to be a man of his word and a fiercely loyal ally. With the mayor's vast resources and unyielding political pressure, Samuel's stalled VA benefits were expedited and fully approved within weeks. Furthermore, Callahan arranged for a top-tier orthopedic surgeon to operate on Samuel's spine, removing the final, agonizing fragments of shrapnel that had caused his crippling limp. But Samuel was not a man built for a life of idle luxury. As his body healed, his mind sought purpose. Oak Haven was changing. The arrest of Mitchell and Rostova had triggered a massive, necessary purge within the police department. Chief Harding instituted strict new oversight protocols, and the toxic culture of the precinct was forcefully dismantled. But the city still had a vulnerable homeless population, many of whom were veterans suffering from the same invisible wounds Samuel had carried. with financial backing from the city and private donations pouring in from across the country, driven by the national news coverage of his story, Samuel opened the Lieutenant David Callahan Veterans Outreach Center. Located just 3 blocks from the Silver Spoon Diner, the center provided hot meals, legal assistance, mental health counseling, and job placement for struggling veterans. Samuel ran the center with the same quiet, compassionate discipline he had used to lead his Ranger squad. He traded his tattered field jacket for a clean polo shirt, bearing the center's logo, but his eyes retained the sharp, observant gaze of a soldier. Jessica Miller, the waitress who had stood up for him that fateful night, was hired as the center's lead administrative director after Mayor Callahan personally ensured her community college tuition was paid in full. 2 years after the incident, Oak Haven was experiencing a rare, sun-drenched autumn afternoon. Samuel was driving a donated pickup truck down Interstate 84, heading toward a hardware store to pick up supplies for the center. As he cruised past the county line, traffic slowed for a roadside maintenance crew. The glaring orange diamond signs warned of inmates at work. Samuel slowed his truck, glancing out the passenger window. A line of men in bright orange, sweat-stained jumpsuits were stabbing at the roadside litter with metal pickers, dragging heavy black garbage bags behind them under the watchful, armed gaze of state corrections officers. Near the guardrail, struggling to pull a discarded, mud-caked tire out of a ditch, was an older inmate. His head was shaved, his face was deeply lined with premature aging and permanent exhaustion, and his thick neck had lost its muscle, replaced by sagging skin. It was Bradley Mitchell. A few yards away, furiously untangling a mass of rusted wire, was Kevin Rostover. Their transfer requests to federal facilities were backlogged, leaving them to serve their preliminary time on county work details. Mitchell paused, wiping a streak of grimy sweat from his forehead, and looked up as the pickup truck rolled by. For a fraction of a second, his sunken, defeated eyes met Samuel's. There was no anger left in Samuel. He didn't honk the horn. He didn't roll down the window to shout an insult. He simply looked at the man who had once tried to destroy him, a man now reduced to picking up actual garbage on the side of a highway, living out the exact insult he had hurled in the diner. Samuel calmly turned his eyes back to the road ahead, pressed his foot gently on the accelerator, and drove forward into the bright, clear afternoon, leaving the ghosts of his past to rot in the ditches they had dug for themselves. The flashing neon sign of the Silver Spoon Diner still buzzes against the Oregon rain, but the shadows it casts have fundamentally changed. The diner stands as a quiet monument to the devastating velocity of karma, a reminder that the measure of a society is found in how it treats its most vulnerable, forgotten souls. Bradley Mitchell and Kevin Rostover learned too late that power devoid of empathy is merely a cage waiting to snap shut. They mistook silence for weakness and a worn coat for a lack of worth, completely blind to the immense, hardened strength forged in the fires of sacrifice. Samuel T. Washington did not seek vengeance. He merely held a mirror up to their corruption, allowing their own hubris to completely consume them. In the end, a single phone call didn't just end 2 careers. It sterilized a poisoned system and brought a wandering soldier exactly where he was always meant to be, home.